and many other...
This is right, Arab.
Hello and welcome to WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Nick Harper, and in this bulletin, we'll get you a roundup of the stories developing around the world. First up, the headlines. Amid heightened tensions between Russia and the West, the Kremlin says President Putin may speak once again before the year ends. Bangladesh's foreign minister slams US sanctions on the country. Anti-terror agency, the RAB, says over 600,000 people disappear in the United States every year. Killings in US are termed in line of duty, whereas ours are labelled extrajudicial. France suspends non-essential travel from the United Kingdom in a bid to slow down the spread of the Omicron variant. A super typhoon slams the Siargao island in the Philippines as thousands of people seek shelter from the strongest storm to hit the country this year. Turkish lira hits fresh historic lows after the central bank cuts the main interest rate for the fourth month running. Five school children are killed and several others seriously injured when a gust of wind blew their bouncy castle into the air at an end-of-term party in Australia. First today, tensions continue to simmer between Russia and the West, this amid possibilities of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. In the latest, Russia has submitted draft documents outlining security arrangements. These are arrangements it wants to negotiate with the United States and its NATO allies. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said it is likely that President Vladimir Putin may hold another round of talks with his American counterpart before the year ends. However, there has been no firm agreements as of yet. The development comes as European nations huddle up, pushing their role as the mediator, as tensions between Russia and Ukraine reach an all-time high. During their summit held earlier today, EU leaders focused on preventing a Russian invasion of Ukraine. They threatened Moscow with unprecedented sanctions, while extending the option of diplomatic talks.
Where Russia has to de-escalate the tensions and to avoid any aggressive actions against Ukraine. Because we are, the European Union member states, all united in order to support the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and any aggressive action will be with higher political and economic costs.
At present, there are reports of a Russian build-up on the border with Ukraine. There are nearly 175,000 Russian troops deployed near the border. Meanwhile, Lithuania's president said that the EU should not underestimate the threat Russia's troop build-up poses.
Unfortunately, we see the concentration, reinforcement of Russian military forces along Ukrainian border. And probably we face most dangerous situation in last 30 years. I am talking not only about Ukraine, but I am talking about eastern flank of NATO, about Baltic region. And I think we have to do everything what is in our hands in order to prevent the worst scenario, which unfortunately we cannot exclude.
Speaking at the meeting, Germany's new Chancellor Olaf Scholz also warned Moscow not to cross any lines.
Und im Übrigen geht es natürlich auch darum.
We will also discuss the difficult Ukraine, the question about troop movements at the border. And therefore, we will emphasize here again today that the inviolability of the borders is one of the very important foundations of peace in Europe, and that we will all jointly do everything for this inviolability to remain in place.
Unverletzbarkeit tatsächlich bleibt.
Many of the leaders said they look towards diplomatic talks to stave off military action in Ukraine. On Wednesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he was ready for any format of talks with Russia, but would still like to see a strong Western sanctions policy to deter Moscow from further escalating the situation.
We have also discussed the sanctions, and several countries expressed their attitude and decisiveness to apply sanctions. What we emphasized is that for us, it is important to have sanctions and applied before rather than after the conflict would happen. Because if they are applied after the conflict would happen, this would basically make them meaningless. And we have the war going on for 8 years. We understand that only if the sanctions are applied prior to the armed conflict would they become a prevention mechanism for any possible escalation.
Well, for more on this story, our correspondent Lucy Hoff is joining us live on this broadcast from Brussels. Well, Lucy, Russian aggression on Europe's border and now a strong message from the EU of pushing back against it. What more can we expect from the EU to try and counter Russia?
There is warnings to Russia of massive consequences if President Putin goes ahead with reported plans for an invasion of Ukraine, warning of a severe cost of such action. This is, of course, after those reports of as many as 175,000 Russian troops lining Ukraine's border. Now, this is due to be discussed by EU leaders in a couple of hours' time. We know from the German Chancellor making his first appearance as German Chancellor at an EU Council summit today, reiterating that message of those consequences, but also saying that the EU should, for the moment, prioritise dialogue with Russia in order to de-escalate the crisis. Now, we know that the Ukrainian president has been urging EU leaders to introduce preemptive sanctions at this stage before any Russian aggression in order to prevent such action. But for the moment, it seems that the EU leaders are unlikely to follow that. They want to keep their cards hidden for the moment, threaten sanctions in order to prevent that action. But certainly this will be one of the key issues on discussion today. But we are not expecting any formal announcement of a sanctions programme at this stage.
And Lucy, just to change tack slightly, these talks have also been looking at the spread of the Omicron variant. How worried is the EU at the moment about Omicron spreading around the region?
It is very worried, Nick, and COVID-19 has been the first issue to be discussed on the agenda in this busy summit, talking about rising infection rates across the continent and, of course, that concern about the Omicron variant. We have had a warning from the EU's executive, the European Commission, that Omicron is likely to become the dominant variant by next month. And, of course, EU leaders here are watching the situation across the Channel in the United Kingdom with concern, given the extraordinary rates of infection there, particularly in the capital city of London. So EU leaders looking to coordinate measures to tackle that spread here, talking about travel restrictions today, given that we have had a number of EU countries such as France, Italy and Portugal reintroducing some border restrictions. In the case of France, closing its borders with the United Kingdom for anyone who is not a French resident or a national. In the case of Italy, demanding that EU nationals show a negative test before arriving on Italian shores. So there has been discussion about how to coordinate such border restrictions at the EU's external border, but also the rollout of that crucial third booster vaccine. There has been some discussion of mandatory vaccines, although that has not formed the foremost part of these discussions, as well as changes to the COVID vaccine passport after the European Commission suggested that there might need to be an expiration date of the current passport after 9 months, given that we know that immunity wanes after just 2 jabs, and giving the bloc time to roll out its booster programme. So lots on the agenda, and we are expecting a press conference in a few hours' time.
Thanks, Lucy. That was Lucy Hoff joining us live from Brussels. Next today, in an escalation of growing diplomatic rifts, Germany has expelled 2 Russian diplomats after a German court ruled that Russia ordered the killing of a former Chechen militant in Berlin. A court in Berlin has sentenced Russian agent Vadim Kryshkov for killing a former Chechen commander, Tonike Taraktvili, on German soil. The presiding judge concluded that Russian state authorities ordered the accused to liquidate the victim. New Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said the murder constitutes a serious violation of German law. She spoke to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and conveyed the same. Russian ambassador to Germany has also been summoned.
Der Generalbundesanwalt ist in seiner
In his indictment, the Attorney General came to the conclusion that this crime was committed on behalf of state authorities of the Russian Federation. This view was endorsed by the court in today's verdict.
Gericht in der heutigen Urteilsverkündung angeschlossen.
Slamming the court order, the Kremlin denounced the expulsion as politically motivated, and Moscow has responded to the decision with a tit-for-tat move. Even now, Moscow has slammed what it called a political ruling against a backdrop of general anti-Russian sentiment. Russia's ambassador to Germany, Sergei Nechkiev, says in a statement, "We consider this verdict to be biased, politically motivated decision that seriously aggravates already difficult Russian-German relations." As the US economy nears full employment and the US central bank copes with a surge of inflation, the Federal Reserve has said it would end its pandemic-era bond purchases. The end of purchases in March will pave the way for 3 quarter percentage point interest rate hikes by the end of 2022. The pace of inflation is uncomfortably high in the United States, and in their new economic projections, policymakers forecast that inflation could run to 2.6% next year, an increase over the 2.2% they projected back in September. But then it's hoped it will fall to 2.3% in 2023 and 2.1% in 2024.
The Federal Open Market Committee kept interest rates near zero and updated its assessment of the progress that the economy has made toward the criteria specified in the committee's forward guidance for interest rates. In addition, in light of the strengthening labor market and elevated inflation pressures, we decided to speed up the reductions in our asset purchases. We are committed to our price stability goal. We will use our tools both to support the economy and a strong labor market and to prevent higher inflation from becoming entrenched. We will be watching carefully to see whether the economy is evolving in line with expectations. The rise in COVID cases in recent weeks, along with the emergence of the Omicron variant, pose risks to the outlook.
Unemployment is seen dropping to 3.5% next year, well below the point Fed officials feel is sustainable in the long run and remaining through 2024. WION correspondent Susan Tarani sent us this report from New York. Listen in.
While the Federal Reserve provided multiple indications on Wednesday that it was willing to make some aggressive moves to tackle the rising inflation here in the United States, for example, accelerating the reduction of its monthly bond purchases, and then after that, a set of interest rate hikes starting in 2022, it's yet to be seen whether or not these measures may be too little too late. Some economists and perhaps consumers wanted to see an even more hawkish approach coming from the Fed. For example, an immediate end to money creation and also immediate interest rate hikes. Now, these measures by the Fed come at a time when the United States is witnessing an inflation it has not seen in almost 40 years. And for a while, Fed officials had maintained that the inflation is transitory. However, White House officials recently said that may not be the case. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
For the first time ever, New York City has got a woman as a police commissioner. Nassau County Police Chief of Detectives, Kashant Sewell, will lead the largest police force in the United States. 49-year-old Sewell will replace Dermot Shear. He will be retiring from the NYPD after 30 years of service. He spent the last 2 years of his service as commissioner. Sewell is a native of Queens. She'll be the third black person to run the NYPD after Benjamin Ward and Lee Brown. They served the NYPD in the 1980s and the 1990s. Sewell will be inheriting the department, though, at a crucial time. The NYPD has struggled to keep crime down.
I stand here today because a man boldly and unapologetically made a decision well before his monumental and successful election. A decision that gave women in policing across this country an opportunity, not a favor, but a chance to work with him, the citizens, and the finest, most storied police department in the world to make New York City a safer city, a more inclusive city, where the community feels connected, heard, and served.
Shifting our focus now to the US state of Kentucky, which has now been hit by a windstorm. But for the residents there, suffering brought by this disaster, it's nothing compared to the impact of the tornadoes it battled over the weekend. President Joe Biden arrived in the state to take stock of the situation. More than 30 tornadoes tore through Kentucky and at least 5 other states. The storms claimed several lives and toppled power poles. As temperatures dropped below freezing in Kentucky, residents were also cut off from key utilities. Communities suffered billions of dollars in damage. President Biden surveyed battered remains of 2 Kentucky cities. With a promise to help rebuild devastated communities, Biden has also offered federal support for the victims. The US President has approved federal disaster declarations for Kentucky and the neighbouring states of Tennessee and Illinois. Biden said the federal government would foot the 100% of the bill for emergency relief for the next 30 days.
And I intend to do whatever it takes as long as it takes to support your state, your local leaders, and as you recover and rebuild, because you will recover and you will rebuild. You know, the scope and scale of this destruction is almost beyond belief. When you look around here, it's just almost beyond belief. These tornadoes devoured everything in their path as well. I just approved the request that I wasn't sure I had the authority to do, but turns out I do. The government's going to cover 100% of the cost. 100% of the cost for the first 30 days for all the emergency work, from clearing everything to every single cost the federal government's going to take care of. And it includes debris removal, cost of overtime and law enforcement, emergency service personnel, and shelter.
Mayfield was the hardest hit of several western Kentucky communities. Cities have been turned into piles of debris and are now being hauled away by work crews and National Guard troops. The city of 10,000 people is under a boil water order and accounts for more than 1/3 of the state's 14,000 power outages. It would take at least 7 to 10 days for crews to resurrect utility poles and hook up transmission lines. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has sent search and rescue and emergency response teams to Kentucky. Teams have been sent to help survivors register for assistance, and FEMA has also sent dozens of generators into the state, along with 500,000 litres of water. Other assistance includes 74,000 meals and thousands of cots, blankets and pandemic shelter kits. In addition to federal aid, more than 500 National Guard troops have been deployed to help with law enforcement, traffic control and recovery.
I saw a guy knocking on doors back there.
After the devastating bushfires of 2019 and 2020 that saw close to 3 billion wild animals killed, Australia is getting ready for this year's fire season. Koalas, already worryingly low in numbers, are particularly vulnerable. And in the Sydney region, they also face many other dangers, including habitat loss and disease. Here's our report.
They are cute, furry and peaceful creatures known around the world as one of Australia's icons. First hunted for their pelts when their population was close to 8 million, koalas now face threats probably worse than human guns and traps. Government authorities, scientists and private organizations dedicated to the protection of the tree marsupials now say their population has dramatically declined, pushing them very close to becoming an endangered species. On top of that, young females will only give birth to one joey per year at most.
What we know with climate change is that this is going to increase in frequency and in severity. They're the two things that we know, and so that's a real challenge that we have to look into the future and forecast and build resilience in our habitats and our response capabilities as well.
Present only in the eastern part of Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and in South Australia, their habitat is threatened by many dangers. Logging and deforestation to make way for housing developments and roads, and the well-documented bushfires are all devastating news for the koalas, who depend on unfragmented forest areas and eucalyptus trees for survival. Roads cutting through a koala's home perimeter are a problem. The marsupial will cross them to get to other trees and thus risk being hit or even killed by vehicles. Housing development and logging basically destroys the whole of a koala's home.
So it's really important that not only do we keep really large areas for koala habitat, that also they're always connected in many veined and many threaded ways with other koala colonies and other habitat areas around, so that therefore those numbers can sort of feed into each other. And it's also really important if we have another bushfire, so that if there's another bushfire event or something like that, koalas can escape to somewhere else.
In recent years, the relentless frequency of natural disasters such as bushfires and droughts is causing much concern. Koalas simply don't have enough time to recover between events. In the 2019-2020 mega bushfires alone, more than 61,000 koalas are thought to have died. Droughts and heat waves create their own special dangers. Since the bushfires, first responders received special training to rescue koalas. The Taronga Conservation Society Australia and the National Park Services have come up with a plan of action and an online training course for first responders in case of a bushfire. The course teaches participants to assess whether wildlife is injured, identify the species and report back to the incident management team coordinating the fire response.
We are the problem, and we need to do a lot better to help these guys live where they live, because they were here before us. We choose to live where they live, and we need to be more mindful of that and learn to do what we can to live more adequately together.
So protecting koalas has a surprisingly broader and more far-reaching positive effect. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
And finally, the Bloody Mary is perhaps one of the world's most iconic drinks. One bar in Paris is now celebrating its 100th birthday. Yep, you heard that right. The first Bloody Mary is believed to have been invented at this very bar 100 years ago. Take a look.
A sprinkling of salt and pepper, a splash of tomato juice, and of course a crucial drop of lemon juice. All mixed in with a shot of vodka. Poured into an old-fashioned glass. And there you have it. These are the makings of a classic drink, aptly called the Bloody Mary. The bartenders at Harry's Bar in Paris can now rustle up this concoction with their eyes closed. And that's because the Bloody Mary is believed to have been invented here on this very counter some 100 years ago.
One of my favorite drinks and my favorite place as well. It's here actually I taste the single malt of whiskey and the Bloody Mary. And as you see, the Bloody Mary is still served in old fashion and it's standard everywhere in the world. Wherever you go in Harry's bar, you find the same.
The iconic watering hole, Harry's, has been around since 1921. Tourists from across the world have it on their bucket list as a must-do on their visit to the French capital. The drink was first made by Frenchman Fernand Petiot in 1921, and ever since, some 12,000 Bloody Marys are served here every year. The Bloody Mary seems to have been named after a dancer who performed in America, but this is hard to verify, so for now we'll have to rely on hearsay. While the pandemic made daily operations difficult for the bar, it could not change the Bloody Mary, not one bit. It still remains a big hit among its patrons. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
Well, that's all we've got time for in today's show. Thanks as always for watching. I'm Nick Harper in Washington, DC. Until next time, goodbye.
There are many other... this is right, Arab.